establishing queenside influence immediately. This opening choice aims for a flexible pawn structure and potential king's Indian attack setups. Developing the knight to this square establishes a flexible central presence, ready to influence pawn structures and control key diagonals. Preparing to contest the center, white develops a knight, aiming for harmonious piece play and potential central pawn advances later. Preparing for Fianchetto, black embraces kingside castling and influences the center. Building a Fianchetto structure, this prepares to develop the bishop to a powerful diagonal, aiming for queenside expansion and potential central control. Unlocking diagonals for the bishop opens lines of attack toward the kingside. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal solidifies the Fianchetto structure and prepares for castling, reinforcing the kingside. Securing the king's safety is paramount, initiating a crucial development phase. Opening the center immediately, preparing for a central pawn storm or piece play. Establishing central influence and preparing to challenge white's pawn structure, this solidifies black's queenside presence. Unifying pieces towards the center establishes a classic English opening structure, preparing for central pawn breaks and improved piece mobility. Developing the bishop to g4 challenges white's knight, potentially disrupting their pawn structure and opening diagonals. Forcing black to decide if the bishop retreat or a confrontation is preferable, solidifying the kingside pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight grants black the bishop pair and a solid central pawn structure, a promising positional advantage. Regaining the pawn immediately strengthens white's center and opens the bishop's diagonal for kingside pressure. Developing the knight here, black solidifies their central pawn structure and prepares to connect their rooks. Reclaiming the diagonal, white reinforces the pawn chain and prepares for kingside expansion, eyeing potential breakthroughs. Rerouting the knight to a central outpost, aiming to reinforce d6 and potentially support a future e5 push. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, white fosters a robust pawn structure. Boldly seizing central space, this thrust creates immediate pawn tension and challenges white's established d4 e3 pawn chain. Establishing a central pawn stronghold and limiting black's knight mobility creates a commanding spatial advantage. Shifting the knight to the queenside aims to support potential pawn advances and consolidate black's central presence. Pioneering a central pawn presence, this move solidifies white's ambitious foothold and restricts black's knight development. A bold pawn thrust aiming to disrupt white's central grip and open attacking avenues on the kingside. Initiating a kingside attack, white aims to pry open lines for his pieces against black's castled monarch. Challenging the center's stability, this pawn thrust aggressively disrupts white's harmonious setup. Challenging the bishop's placement redirects the attack's focus, creating new avenues for piece development. This rook gambit initiates an aggressive kingside assault, sacrificing material to destabilize white's pawn structure and open attacking lines for black's remaining pieces. Shifting the queen here prepares for either a queenside push or to support the center. Sacrificing the bishop here opens fascinating diagonals, yet creates king safety concerns later on. Unlocking the kingside blockade, this bishop now eyes the central tension, seeking influence over the d5 pawn. Asserting control over the central squares and preparing for a pawn advance on the kingside, this knight repositions to influence the queenside. Unlocking the queenside, white seeks to exploit the vulnerable pawn chain and gain space against black's somewhat cramped position. Unleashing a pawn storm, black gambles with this advance, hoping to rupture white's solid central structure and expose the king. Unlocking the queen for central pressure, white prepares to contest the open d-file, potentially aiming for a kingside pawn storm later. Liberating the bishop to gain space on the kingside opens new attacking avenues. Exposing the king risks immediate counterplay along the newly opened diagonal and files. Re-establishing pressure on the queenside knight. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, with a view to eventually challenging the isolated d-pawn. Challenging white's pawn chain and opening a vital file for your rook. Sensing the opponent's weakened kingside, white bravely ventures the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the kingside. Gaining a foothold on the queenside to challenge white's pawn structure. Securing the queenside with a firm grip, this move seeks to expand and stifle black's counterplay before the central tension ignites further. Shifting the rook to the b-file prepares to contest it, potentially creating dynamic play along that open corridor. Asserting dominance over the semi-open c-file, this rook aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and pressure the queenside. Challenging white's queenside structure and seeking to open lines for counterplay. Undermining black's queenside pawns with this pawn thrust creates immediate structural weaknesses. A decisive attempt to pry open the queenside, disrupting white's pawns and potentially activating the knight. Smashing through the queenside with a pawn thrust, aiming to shatter black's delicate pawn structure. Relocating the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the open files and potentially disrupt white's queenside buildup. Reasserting central presence, this rook prepares to join the fight on the kingside if opportunities arise. The knight reroutes, seeking a better square on g7 to support the kingside and potentially join the central fight. Reinforcing the e-file provides a crucial pivot for potential pawn advances, preparing to contest the center's growing instability. Repositioning the queen to f8 aims to improve its connectivity with the kingside, and potentially support a future kingside pawn push. Initiating a bold queenside thrust, this move aims to disrupt black's compact pawn structure and create dynamic imbalances across the board. Shifting the rook to the queenside prepares to contest the open c-file and support the pawn advance. Unlocking the queenside with this knight maneuver creates immediate pressure on black's weak pawn structure. Shifting the queen to the 7th rank eyes the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepares potential support for the f-pawn advance. A surprising regrouping, aiming to pry open the queenside while reinforcing the king's sanctuary. Creating a fortress around the king on the queenside, aiming to lock down the pawn structure and deny white space. Seizing the open file, white boldly sacrifices a rook for initiative, disrupting black's pawn structure and opening lines towards the enemy king. Repositioning the rook to challenge the isolated pawn on b6 establishes a robust defensive posture and prepares for counterplay on the queenside. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to bypass the pawn chain and potentially assault the kingside or reinforce the center. Relocating the king to h7 shores up its safety on the kingside and prepares for potential pawn storms or discovered attacks. Unlocking the queenside with the rook transfer prepares for a kingside onslaught. Reining in the knight to a better square, preparing to contest the open files and potentially support an eventual kingside advance. Reinforcing the central knight unlocks potential queenside expansion and pressures black's cramped position. Exploring the central void, nh6 repositions to eye white's queenside while simultaneously offering a defensive retreat, a subtle yet flexible deployment. Reinforces the e1 square, allowing for potential centralization or defense against black's active pieces. Boldly igniting a queenside skirmish, the knight lunges towards the unprotected king, potentially destabilizing white's central structure and forcing defensive concessions. Sensing black's kingside passivity, white probes for weaknesses on the queenside by centralizing the queen, preparing to exploit open files. Seeking to solidify its queenside presence, this maneuver aims to reposition the queen, potentially supporting a future pawn push or eyeing weaknesses on the king's flank. Mobilizing the king into the thick of the action, aiming to bolster the queenside defenses and escape the impending knight threat. Repositioning the rook to the f-file initiates a quiet maneuver, seeking to connect the rooks and prepare for a potential breakthrough or defensive consolidation. Initiating a daring pawn thrust to disrupt black's defensive structure on the queenside. Recapturing the knight aims to re-establish peace harmony on the kingside and prepare for further central action. Exchanging these bishops clears open lines, potentially benefiting your active pieces by increasing their scope. Opening the h-file now allows white's king to become exposed. Unleashing a bold knight foray, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open attacking lines. Repositioning the knight to a more active square allows it to eye key squares and potentially support future pawn advances. Securing the queenside outpost with the pawn creates a vital foothold for future operations. Relinquishing the kingside pawn allows the enemy rook to become dangerously active on the 7th rank. Unlocking the queenside with a bold pawn thrust, aiming to sever black's defenses and exploit the open diagonals. Seeking a better queen post, anticipating the raking bishop and pressure on the kingside. Shifting the knight to b2 aims to support the pawns, and prepare a potential sortie for the knight into the enemy camp. Injecting fresh life into the queenside with this knight hop, preparing to harass white's vulnerable pawns. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, seeking control of the central squares and potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance. Reactivating the knight for an offensive sortie, aiming to destabilize white's queenside structure. Repositioning the queen aims to improve its influence and potentially target the weakened queenside. A patient repositioning of the queen aims to contest the open file and prepare for potential maneuvers on the kingside. Opening a flank avenue here aims to create immediate counterplay against the isolated black pawn structure. The queen repositions, seeking a less restricted influence and preparing for potential kingside action. Unleashing the king from its sanctuary, a bold gambit to ignite dynamism. Consolidating the rook behind the pawn wall prepares for a potential queenside push. Pivoting the queen aims to exploit the open kingside files and create pressure on black's weak pawns. Shifting the knight to the queenside opens new attacking angles. Initiating rook lift to activate a dormant piece. Opening the g-file, black sacrifices pawn structure for a potential attack on white's exposed monarch. Opening the h-file with this capture drastically increases attacking potential, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Securing the e-file with the rook offers a vital defensive anchor against white's looming queenside pressure. Opening the queen's diagonal provides an escape route, but it simultaneously exposes the monarch to potential future threats. Attempting to uncoil that tangled pawn structure offers black a chance to breathe. Pivoting the knight to c3 aims to reinforce the pawn chain's structural integrity. Exploiting the exposed king, this audacious knight sacrifice opens a direct assault, aiming to dismantle the opponent's defenses. The rook now abandons its defensive post on the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on black's unleashed king. The queen now faces a precarious position, a beacon of danger amidst the scattered pawns, potentially becoming a target itself. Solidifying the central control aims to prevent further infiltration by black's knights.